The auctioneer's voice rang out like a death knell across the dusty town square of Willow Creek, Colorado, as Harriet Montgomery stood trembling on the auction block, her heart shattering with each shouted bid. It was 1876, and at 22 years of age, she never imagined she would find herself being sold to cover her late father's debts, her fate hanging in the balance as strangers calculated her worth with cold, appraising eyes. Harriet blinked back tears, her hands bound before her with rough rope that chafed her delicate wrists. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment with white lace trim that had once belonged to her mother, now soiled from days of travel in the back of a creditor's wagon. Her chestnut hair, usually neatly pinned, hung in limp waves around her tear-streaked face. $200 for the girl. Do I hear $250? The auctioneer called, gesturing toward Harriet as if she were nothing more than cattle. The crowd of men ranchers, merchants, and miners studied her with varying degrees of interest and malice. Harriet's gaze dropped to her worn boots, unable to bear the weight of those stares a moment longer. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been the respectable daughter of a merchant, helping in her father's general store. Then came his sudden heart attack, followed by the devastating discovery of his enormous gambling debts. The creditors had shown no mercy, seizing everything in the store, their modest home, and finally, Harriet herself. $250 from Mr. Jenkins. Do I hear $300? The voice that responded sent ice through Harriet's veins. $300, called Gerard Blackwood, the owner of the town's saloon, and a man known for his cruelty toward the women who worked for him. Harriet had heard whispers about the fate of girls who ended up in his establishment. $300 from Mr. Blackwood. Going once. $500. The new voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Deep, steady, and commanding, it silenced the auction square. Harriet raised her head, desperate to see who had spoken. He stood at the back of the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather duster that had seen its share of hard travel. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of stubble. Unlike the leering gazes of the other men, his eyes met hers with something resembling dignity. $500 from the stranger, the auctioneer announced, clearly surprised by the substantial increase. Do I hear $550? Blackwood turned, his face contorted with anger. $550. $600, the stranger countered without hesitation. The bidding continued, climbing higher as the two men battled for ownership of Harriet's life. She watched in stunned silence, tears streaming freely down her face now. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the unusual spectacle of such competitive bidding. $800, Blackwood spat, his patience clearly wearing thin. $1,000, the stranger replied calmly. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Such an amount could buy a decent plot of land with a small cabin. The auctioneer's eyes widened with greed. $1,000. Going once. Going twice. Blackwood cursed loudly, but remained silent.
Sold.
To the gentleman in the back. Relief flooded through Harriet, though it was quickly tempered by uncertainty. Who was this man who had paid such an exorbitant sum? What did he want with her? At least she had been spared from Blackwood's saloon, but what awaited her now? The stranger approached the auction block, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle, his gait slightly bow-legged from years spent on horseback. As he drew closer, Harriet could see his features more clearly, eyes the color of a summer sky, weathered skin bronzed by the sun, and a small scar that traced the edge of his right eyebrow. The auctioneer handed him the papers that transferred ownership of Harriet's indentured contract. The stranger barely glanced at them before tucking them inside his coat. Then he stood before the block, looking up at Harriet with an unreadable expression. "Come down from there, miss," he said, his voice gentler than before. He extended a hand toward her. Harriet hesitated, her legs unsteady beneath her. The stranger's expression softened slightly. "You're coming home," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. With trembling legs, Harriet took his offered hand and stepped down from the auction block. His fingers were calloused but warm around hers, and he supported her weight easily as she descended. "Name's Kieran Hayes," he said, releasing her hand once she was steady on her feet. "I've got a ranch about half a day's ride from here." "Harriet Montgomery," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Sir, I don't understand why not here," he interrupted, glancing around at the dispersing crowd, many of whom were still watching them with curiosity. "We'll talk on the trail." Kieran led her through the town toward the livery stable, maintaining a respectful distance, but staying close enough to deter any unwanted attention. Harriet noticed that he positioned himself between her and Blackwood, who glared at them from the doorway of his saloon. At the stable, a magnificent chestnut stallion waited, saddled and ready. Kieran untied the horse and checked the saddle straps before turning to Harriet. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. Her father had taught her as a child, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. Kieran nodded, then stepped forward with a small knife. Harriet flinched instinctively, but he simply cut the ropes binding her wrists. The relief was immediate, and she rubbed at the raw skin gratefully. "Thank you," she murmured. He handed her a canteen.
"Drink."
"It's a long ride ahead." The water was cool and sweet against her parched throat. She drank deeply, only now realizing how thirsty she had been. Kieran helped her mount the horse, then swung up behind her. The saddle wasn't designed for two riders, placing them in uncomfortably close proximity. Harriet stiffened as his arms reached around her to take the reins. "I apologize for the arrangement," he said, seeming to sense her discomfort. "I wasn't planning on having a passenger today." They rode out of town at a steady pace, drawing stares from townspeople going about their business. Harriet kept her eyes forward, determined not to show any more weakness than she already had. Once the buildings of Willow Creek fell away behind them, replaced by rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, she felt her breathing ease slightly. They rode in silence for nearly an hour before Kieran spoke again. "Are you hungry?" Harriet nodded. The creditors had provided only minimal sustenance during her journey to Willow Creek, and she hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Kieran guided the horse toward a small copse of cottonwood trees near a stream. He dismounted first, then helped Harriet down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Her legs wobbled after the long ride, and she grabbed his arm to steady herself. "Sorry," she said, quickly letting go. "No need to apologize." He gestured toward a fallen log. "Rest there. I'll get some food." Harriet sank onto the log gratefully, while Kieran tended to the horse, removing its bridle so it could drink from the stream. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky, dried apples, and a small loaf of bread that looked relatively fresh. He handed her a portion and sat down on a rock several feet away, giving her space. Harriet ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of decorum, but hunger soon overwhelmed her manners, and she devoured the simple meal. When she had finished, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Mr. Hayes, why did you buy my contract?" Kieran took his time answering, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I know what it's like to be at the mercy of others," he said finally. "I couldn't stand by and watch Blackwood take you. That man's reputation isn't a mystery to anyone within 50 miles. But $1,000. Harriet shook her head in disbelief. "That's an enormous sum." A slight smile touched his lips. "I've had a few good years with the cattle. I can afford it." "What do you expect in return?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Men didn't spend that kind of money without expecting something significant in return. "I need help around the ranch," he said simply. "The house needs tending, meals need cooking. I've been managing alone, but poorly." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Your contract is for 2 years. I'll provide food, shelter, and protection. When the time is up, you'll be free to go your own way with wages saved to start fresh." Harriet studied him, looking for any sign of deception. His expression remained open, his blue eyes steady on hers. "And that's all," she pressed. Kieran's face hardened slightly. "Miss Montgomery, I'm not in the habit of forcing myself on women. You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. I won't enter without your permission." Heat rushed to Harriet's cheeks. "I apologize for the implication. It's just that." "I understand," he said, his expression softening again. "You have no reason to trust me, but I give you my word you'll be safe at my ranch." Something in his tone convinced her he was telling the truth, at least as he saw it. Harriet nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Kieran," he corrected. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, there's no need for formalities." They continued their journey after the brief rest, riding through rolling grasslands that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the vast blue sky. As the afternoon wore on, Harriet found herself increasingly aware of the man behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in the arms that occasionally brushed against her when the horse navigated uneven terrain. Kieran proved to be a man of few words, answering her occasional questions about the land and his ranch with polite but brief responses. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber, Harriet caught sight of buildings in the distance. "Is that your ranch?" she asked, straightening in the saddle. "Yes," Kieran replied. "Hayes Ranch. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine." As they drew closer, Harriet could make out a modest but well-maintained ranch house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods and willows that provided welcome shade. Several cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, and chickens scratched in the dirt near a small coop. "It's lovely," Harriet said sincerely. "It's home," Kieran replied, and she detected a note of pride in his voice. As they approached the main house, a dog came bounding toward them, a large black and white border collie that barked excitedly. "That's Scout," Kieran said. "Best cattle dog in the territory." He guided the horse to a halt in front of the house and dismounted before helping Harriet down. Her legs felt stiff and sore after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Kieran's hands steadied her before quickly releasing her. "Thank you," she murmured, smoothing her rumpled dress self-consciously. The dog approached cautiously, head low, studying the newcomer with intelligent eyes. "He won't hurt you," Kieran assured her. "Scout, this is Harriet. She's staying with us now." Harriet extended her hand, allowing the dog to sniff her fingers. After a moment's consideration, Scout wagged his tail and pressed his head against her palm. "He likes you," Kieran observed, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I've always been good with animals," Harriet replied, stroking the dog's soft fur. Her father had never allowed pets in their home above the store, claiming they were unsanitary, but she had always longed for one. Kieran led the horse toward the barn. "I need to tend to Thunder. Make yourself at home." The doors unlocked. Left alone with the dog, Harriet approached the house with trepidation. The porch was swept clean, with 2 rocking chairs facing the setting sun. She hesitated at the door, then gathered her courage and stepped inside. The main room combined a kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace at one end and a wooden table with 4 chairs at the other. The furnishings were simple but of good quality: a leather armchair, a small sofa covered with a Navajo blanket, shelves lined with books. Everything was relatively clean but had the slightly disheveled look of a home maintained by someone with limited time or inclination for housekeeping. A hallway led to what she presumed were bedrooms. Harriet remained in the main room, unsure of her place in this unfamiliar house. Scout had followed her inside and now settled on a rug near the cold fireplace, watching her with curious eyes. Would you like to see your room? Kieran's deep voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it. Yes, please, she replied, clasping her hands before her. He led her down the hallway past a door he identified as his bedroom, then opened the next door. This will be yours. The room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a wash basin. A window overlooked the creek and the willows beyond. It's not much, Kieran said, almost apologetically. But it's clean. The previous owner's daughter used it before they sold me the place. It's perfect, Harriet said honestly. After the nightmare of the past weeks, culminating in standing on that auction block, even this simple room felt like luxury. As promised, Kieran added, pointing to the door, there's a lock. The key is in the drawer. Harriet nodded gratefully. Thank you. I'll let you get settled, he said, turning to leave. There's a trunk with some women's clothing in the attic. The rancher's wife, who lived here before, was about your size. I'll bring it down for you. That's very kind, Harriet replied, touched by the consideration. Once alone, she sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. This morning, she had awakened in a cell, expecting to be sold into a life of degradation. Now she found herself in a comfortable room on a beautiful ranch, with a locked door between her and a man who, thus far, had treated her with nothing but respect. It seemed too good to be true, and Harriet had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But for tonight, at least, she was safe. She closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for this unexpected reprieve. True to his word, Kieran soon returned with a wooden trunk, which he placed at the foot of her bed. There should be some dresses and other necessities in here, he said. I'll prepare something for supper while you change, if you'd like. I can cook, Harriet offered quickly. It's the least I can do. Kieran studied her for a moment, then nodded. If you feel up to it. The kitchen is stocked, though not with much variety. I'm afraid my cooking skills are limited to what can be prepared in one pot. Harriet managed a small smile. I'll see what I can do. After Kieran left, closing the door behind him, Harriet opened the trunk. Inside were several dresses of simple but good quality, along with undergarments, nightgowns, a shawl, and even a pair of sturdy boots that looked close to her size. There was also a hairbrush, a hand mirror, and some basic toiletries. She selected a clean dress, a simple gingham in soft green, and quickly changed out of her soiled blue one. The dress fit reasonably well, if a bit loose around the waist. After washing her face and hands in the basin and brushing her tangled hair into some semblance of order, Harriet felt almost human again. In the kitchen, she found Kieran had laid out some basic ingredients: potatoes, onions, a piece of salt pork, and flour. The pantry yielded more treasures: dried beans, cornmeal, molasses, coffee, and even some dried apples. I can make cornbread and a potato stew, she suggested, rolling up her sleeves. Sounds like a feast to me, Kieran replied, setting about building a fire in the stove. They worked in companionable silence, Harriet preparing the food while Kieran brought in more firewood, fed Scout, and set the table. By the time the simple meal was ready, night had fallen completely, and oil lamps cast a warm glow throughout the main room. As they sat down to eat, Harriet studied her benefactor across the table. In the lamplight, his features seemed less harsh, the blue of his eyes warmer. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, with streaks of silver just beginning to appear at his temples. This is delicious, Kieran said after his first bite of the stew. I can't remember the last time I ate something that wasn't burned on the bottom. Harriet felt a small surge of pride. Thank you. I help with the cooking at home, since my mother died when I was 14. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. Thank you. Harriet hesitated, then asked, Have you lived here long? 5 years, Kieran replied. Bought it when it was barely more than a shack and a few hundred acres. Been building it up since then. Alone? She asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. I apologize. That's none of my business. No apology needed, he assured her. And yes, mostly alone. I hire hands during calving and roundup, but it's just me and Scout most of the time. No family. The question slipped out before she could stop it. A shadow crossed Kieran's face. Not anymore. The pain in those two words silenced any further questions Harriet might have had. They finished the meal, making only occasional comments about the food or the ranch. After supper, Kieran insisted on helping with the dishes despite Harriet's protests. You cooked, he said firmly. I'll dry. As they stood side by side at the wash basin, Harriet was acutely aware of his presence, the slight scent of leather and horses that clung to him, the careful way he handled the plates and cups, as if afraid his strong hands might break them. When the kitchen was clean, Kieran added wood to the fireplace. I usually read for a while before turning in, he said, gesturing to the bookshelves. You're welcome to any of the books. Thank you, Harriet replied, surprised by the offer. Her father had never seen the value in books for women, claiming they gave them ideas above their station. She selected a volume of poetry and settled on the sofa, while Kieran took the armchair, a thick volume about cattle breeding in his hands. Scout lay between them, his head on his paws, eyes drifting closed. The domesticity of the scene struck Harriet suddenly, the crackling fire, the comfortable silence, the dog dozing contentedly. It was as far from the horror of the auction block as she could imagine, yet it had been just that morning. Tears welled in her eyes before she could prevent them. Miss Montgomery? Are you unwell? Kieran had noticed her distress, his brow furrowed with concern. No, I'm fine, she said quickly, wiping at her cheeks. It's just been quite a day. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. You've been through an ordeal. Anyone would be overwhelmed. I still can't believe you paid so much money for my contract, Harriet said softly. You don't even know me. I know enough, he replied. I know you didn't deserve what was happening to you. Harriet studied him, trying to reconcile this compassionate man with the imposing figure who had commanded the auction square with his presence. You're a good man, Mr. Hayes, Kieran. A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or doubt crossed his features. I try to do what's right, he said simply. You should rest now. Morning comes early on a ranch. Taking the gentle dismissal as it was intended, Harriet returned the book to the shelf and bid him good night. In her room, she changed into one of the nightgowns from the trunk, marveling at the soft cotton against her skin after days in the same clothes. Before climbing into bed, she retrieved the key from the drawer and locked the door, then tested it to be sure. The small click of the lock turning was unexpectedly reassuring. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind in the willows by the creek, the occasional howl of a coyote, Harriet tried to make sense of her drastically changed circumstances. Had it really been just this morning that she stood trembling on that auction block? Just yesterday that she'd huddled in a cold cell, certain her life was over? And now here she was, in a comfortable bed in a room of her own, her belly full of good food, under the protection of a man who seemed determined to treat her with respect. It was too much to comprehend. Harriet closed her eyes, expecting sleep to elude her after such a tumultuous day, but exhaustion claimed her almost instantly, pulling her into a deep, dreamless slumber. The crowing of a rooster pulled Harriet from sleep just as dawn light began filtering through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her still drowsy mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. She dressed quickly in another of the dresses from the trunk, a simple blue calico that was practical for housework, and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Kieran was already there, stoking the fire in the stove. "Good morning," he said, straightening up. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Harriet replied, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She had braided her hair hastily and knew she must look far from presentable. If Kieran noticed, he gave no indication. "Coffee's brewing," he said, nodding toward a pot on the stove. "I have to check on a heifer that's about to calve, but I'll be back for breakfast, if that's all right." "Of course," Harriet assured him. "I'll have it ready." After Kieran left, Harriet set about exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. She found eggs in a basket by the door freshly collected, she guessed, and salt pork in the cold box. There was flour for biscuits and a crock of honey that smelled of wildflowers. By the time Kieran returned, she had prepared a hearty breakfast of biscuits, eggs, and fried salt pork. His eyebrows rose in appreciation as he entered the kitchen, bringing with him the crisp scent of the morning air. "This looks wonderful," he said, washing his hands in the basin before sitting down. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Kieran spoke again. "I need to ride the north pasture today to check on the cattle. I should be back by midday." Harriet nodded. "I'll use the time to get better acquainted with the house. It could use a good cleaning." She immediately worried he might take offense, but Kieran just chuckled. "It could use a good many things, I expect. I'm not much for housekeeping." After breakfast, Kieran showed her where to find the cleaning supplies, the garden plot behind the house where some vegetables grew rather haphazardly, and the chicken coop where she could collect eggs. He introduced her to his horse, Thunder, and the 2 milk cows, Daisy and Buttercup, explaining that one of the ranch hands who lived in the distant bunkhouse usually handled the milking. "How many hands do you employ?" Harriet asked, surprised that she hadn't seen anyone else yet. "Just 2 at the moment, brothers, Jake and Tom Miller."
"Good men."
"They're out with the main herd for a few days. You'll meet them when they return." Kieran hesitated, then added, "I should warn you, they don't have much experience with ladies. They might be a bit awkward at first." "I understand," Harriet assured him. She had grown up in a small frontier town and was accustomed to the sometimes rough manners of working men. Before leaving, Kieran showed her where he kept a rifle above the door. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Harriet shook her head. "I'll teach you when I return," he said. "It's unlikely you'll need it, but out here, it's best to be prepared. Scout will stay with you. He'll warn you if anyone approaches." With that, he mounted Thunder and rode off toward the distant pastures, the border collie remaining dutifully at Harriet's side. Left alone, Harriet surveyed the house with a housekeeper's critical eye. While not filthy, it showed the neglect of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. Dust had accumulated on surfaces, the floors needed sweeping, and the windows were clouded with grime. She set to work with determination, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind occupied. By midday, she had swept and mopped the main room, dusted the shelves, and was washing the windows when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Scout, who had been dozing on the porch, perked up his ears and trotted down to greet Kieran as he dismounted. Harriet watched from the window as man and dog exchanged greetings, Kieran kneeling to ruffle the collie's fur affectionately. When Kieran entered the house, he stopped in his tracks, looking around in amazement. "I hardly recognize the place," he said, removing his hat. "You've worked wonders." Harriet smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "There's still much to do, but it's a start." "You didn't have to work so hard on your first day," Kieran said, a note of concern in his voice. "You're still recovering from your ordeal." "The work helped, actually," Harriet admitted. "It kept me from dwelling on everything." Kieran nodded in understanding. "Still, don't overdo it. There's no rush." They shared a simple lunch of leftover cornbread and some beans Harriet had set to soak for dinner. Afterward, true to his word, Kieran took her outside to teach her how to handle the rifle. "It's heavier than it looks," Harriet said, surprised by the weight as he carefully placed it in her hands. "You'll get used to it," Kieran assured her, showing her how to hold it properly. "The key is to brace it against your shoulder, like this." He stood behind her, adjusting her stance with gentle touches to her elbows and shoulders. Harriet was intensely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his breath against her hair as he leaned close to demonstrate how to sight along the barrel. "Now, take a deep breath, let half of it out, and squeeze the trigger slowly," he instructed. Harriet followed his directions, flinching slightly at the loud report and the kick against her shoulder. Her shot went wide of the tin can he had set up as a target, but Kieran nodded approvingly. "Good first attempt. You didn't drop the rifle or close your eyes, which is more than I can say for most beginners." They practiced for another hour, Harriet gradually becoming more comfortable with the weapon. By the end of the lesson, she had managed to hit the target twice, which Kieran assured her was excellent progress. "You're a natural," he said as they walked back to the house, the rifle now unloaded and safe in his hands. "I doubt that," Harriet laughed, rubbing her sore shoulder. "But I appreciate the encouragement." The next several days fell into a rhythm. Harriet rose early to prepare breakfast before Kieran headed out to work the ranch. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and gradually bringing order to the neglected house. In the evenings, they would share supper and then sit by the fire, reading or sometimes just talking. Kieran proved to be surprisingly well-read for a rancher, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He told her about his herd, his plans to expand the ranch, and stories about the early days when he had first arrived in Colorado. What he didn't speak about was his past before coming west, and Harriet sensed it was a subject best left unexplored. For her part, Harriet shared memories of her mother, her life helping in her father's store, and her dreams of someday becoming a teacher. She carefully avoided discussing her father's gambling or the events that had led to her being sold at auction. Those wounds were still too fresh. On the 5th day, the Miller brothers returned from their time with the main herd. They were indeed awkward around Harriet at first, removing their hats and stumbling over their words when Kieran introduced them. Jake, the elder at perhaps 25, could barely meet her eyes, while Tom, a few years younger, stared openly until his brother elbowed him in the ribs. "Miss Montgomery will be staying at the ranch," Kieran explained, his tone making it clear that no further explanation would be forthcoming. "She's bringing some much-needed civilization to the place." "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Harriet said warmly, hoping to put them at ease. "I hope you'll join us for supper. I've made a stew and apple pie." That invitation broke the ice effectively. Both men accepted enthusiastically, and by the end of the meal, they were chatting comfortably, regaling her with tales of life on the range that had her laughing despite herself. After the brothers left for the bunkhouse, Kieran helped Harriet clear the table. "You handled them well," he observed. "They're good boys, but haven't had much experience with polite company." "They're charming in their own way," Harriet replied. "And they clearly respect you a great deal." "We've been through some hard times together," Kieran said, his expression growing distant. 2 years ago, we lost half the herd in a blizzard. They could have found work elsewhere, but they stayed to help rebuild." "That speaks well of both them and you," Harriet said softly. Kieran's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that made Harriet's heart beat faster. Then he looked away, returning to the task of drying dishes. As the days turned into weeks, Harriet found herself settling into life at Hayes Ranch with surprising ease. The house was transformed under her care, becoming a warm and welcoming home. She planted a proper vegetable garden, began making cheese from the cow's milk, and even set up a small loom in a corner of the main room to weave rugs from what Kieran provided. For his part, Kieran seemed to soften in her presence. He smiled more frequently, laughed at her small jokes, and began bringing her wildflowers he found while out riding the range. These small tokens appeared without comment, simply placed in a jar on the kitchen table or on the windowsill in her bedroom, but each one warmed Harriet's heart. One evening, about a month after her arrival, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Scout lay at Harriet's feet, having appointed himself her constant companion when Kieran was away from the house. "I received a letter from the mercantile in town today," Kieran said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The books you ordered have arrived." Harriet's face lit up. She had mentioned missing her small collection of novels, and Kieran had immediately offered to order some from Denver. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "That was so thoughtful of you." "It's nothing," he replied, though he looked pleased by her reaction. "I'll ride in tomorrow to collect them." "May I come with you?" Harriet asked impulsively. She hadn't left the ranch since her arrival and suddenly longed for a change of scenery. Kieran hesitated. "Are you sure? The town isn't much, just a small trading post, a saloon, and a few houses." "I'd still like to see it," she insisted. "And perhaps there might be fabric at the mercantile. I could make some new curtains for the parlor." After a moment's consideration, Kieran nodded. "Very well. We'll make a day of it." The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for the 10-mile ride to the small settlement Kieran called simply town. Harriet wore her best dress from the trunk, a pretty lavender calico with white piping, and braided her hair carefully. When she emerged from her room, Kieran was waiting by the door, dressed in a clean shirt and his least-worn jeans. He stared at her for a moment before quickly averting his gaze. "You look very nice," he said, his voice slightly gruff. "Thank you," Harriet replied, pleased by the compliment. "So do you." For the journey, Kieran had saddled a gentle mare named Penny for Harriet to ride. "She's steady and won't give you any trouble," he assured her as he helped her mount. The ride to town was pleasant, the late spring landscape vibrant with wildflowers and new growth. Harriet found herself laughing more freely than she had in months as Kieran pointed out landmarks and told stories about the area's history. The town, when they reached it, was indeed small, a dusty main street lined with a handful of wooden buildings. The mercantile was the largest, with a hitching post out front where several horses already stood. Kieran helped Harriet dismount and secured their horses before offering her his arm. "Mrs. Wilson runs the store," he explained as they approached. "She's a good woman, but a terrible gossip. Word of your presence will be all over the county by sundown." "What will you tell her about me?" Harriet asked, suddenly anxious. Kieran's expression grew serious. "Only what you wish me to tell. Your story is your own, Harriet." Touched by his consideration, Harriet squeezed his arm gratefully. "Thank you." Mrs. Wilson proved to be exactly as Kieran had described, a plump, friendly woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Kieran warmly, then turned her curious gaze to Harriet. "And who might this lovely young lady be?" she asked, not even attempting to disguise her interest. "This is Miss Harriet Montgomery," Kieran replied smoothly. "She's working as my housekeeper." Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, her expression turning speculative. Before she could ask more questions, Kieran added, "We've come to collect the books I ordered and perhaps look at some fabric for curtains." Of course, Mrs. Wilson bustled around the counter. "The books arrived just yesterday, and I have some lovely new fabrics that came all the way from St. Louis." While Kieran retrieved the books, Harriet examined the bolts of fabric, eventually selecting a cheerful yellow cotton with a small floral pattern. Mrs. Wilson chatted continuously as she measured and cut the fabric, asking seemingly innocent questions that were clearly designed to extract information. "And where are you from originally, Miss Montgomery?" "Colorado Springs," Harriet replied truthfully, though she offered no details about the circumstances that had brought her to Hayes Ranch. "Such a fine city. And do you have family there still?" "No," Harriet said, her voice growing quieter. "I have no family left." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, dear. It's a blessing you found a position with Mr. Hayes. He's one of the good ones, though he keeps to himself more than is healthy for a man his age." Kieran returned with the books before Mrs. Wilson could continue her gentle interrogation. He paid for both the books and the fabric despite Harriet's protests, then suggested they visit the small cafe next door for lunch. That was uncomfortable, Harriet admitted as they left the mercantile. I felt like I was being examined under a microscope. Kieran chuckled. Mrs. Wilson means well. She's appointed herself guardian of everyone's business in a 50-mile radius. The cafe was run by a Chinese couple who greeted Kieran with obvious affection. Mr. Lee showed them to a small table by the window, while Mrs. Lee hurried to bring them tea, without being asked. Kieran Hayes, she exclaimed, her English heavily accented but clear. Too long since you visit. You too skinny, need more food. Hello, Mrs. Lee. Kieran replied with a smile warmer than any Harriet had seen from him. This is Miss Montgomery. Mrs. Lee studied Harriet with approval. Pretty lady. You Kieran's wife now. Harriet blushed furiously, while Kieran nearly choked on his tea. No, Mrs. Lee, he corrected hastily. Miss Montgomery is my housekeeper. Mrs. Lee looked disappointed, but quickly recovered. No matter. I bring special lunch. Fatten you both up. The meal that followed was delicious fragrant rice, tender beef with vegetables and a savory sauce, and dumplings that melted in the mouth. Harriet had never tasted Chinese cuisine before and found herself delighting in the new flavors. This is wonderful, she said, after trying a particularly delicious dumpling. The Lees are a treasure, Kieran agreed. They came here during the gold rush years ago. When the mines played out, most folks left, but they stayed and opened this cafe. Their cooking is the main reason anyone still comes to this town. After lunch, they strolled through the small settlement, Kieran pointing out the sheriff's office, usually empty as the sheriff covered several communities, the saloon which he advised Harriet to avoid, and a small church that held services whenever a circuit preacher passed through. As they walked back toward the mercantile where their horses were tied, a rough voice called out, Well, if it ain't the high and mighty Mr. Hayes. Kieran tensed beside her. Approaching them were three men who had clearly spent the morning in the saloon. The leader, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard and bloodshot eyes, swaggered toward them with a malicious grin. Didn't expect to see you in town, Hayes. You usually avoid civilized company. Burroughs, Kieran acknowledged coldly. We were just leaving. The man's gaze shifted to Harriet, his eyes narrowing as they traveled over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. And who's this pretty little thing? Finally found yourself a woman, Hayes? Kieran stepped slightly in front of Harriet, his posture protective. Miss Montgomery is none of your concern, Burroughs. I suggest you go back to your drinking. Miss Montgomery, is it? Burroughs removed his hat in a mocking gesture of politeness. You should know the kind of man you're keeping company with, miss. Did he tell you about his past? About what he did back east? That's enough. Kieran's voice was dangerously quiet. Miss Montgomery, please wait for me by the horses. Harriet hesitated, reluctant to leave him facing three men alone, but the look in Kieran's eyes convinced her to obey. She walked quickly toward the mercantile, heart pounding, but remained close enough to hear the conversation. You're drunk, Burroughs, Kieran said evenly. Go home before you say something you'll regret. Truth hurts, don't it? Burroughs sneered. Think your fancy lady would still look at you if she knew. Whatever he had been about to say was cut off as Kieran moved with surprising speed, gripping the front of Burroughs' shirt and speaking in a voice too low for Harriet to hear. The other man's face paled, and when Kieran released him, he stumbled back several steps. Come on, boys, Burroughs muttered to his companions. Ain't worth the trouble. The three men retreated toward the saloon, Burroughs casting one last venomous glance over his shoulder. Kieran rejoined Harriet by the horses, his expression unreadable. I apologize for that unpleasantness, he said stiffly. Burroughs has had a grudge against me since I refused to sell him grazing rights on my land. Harriet studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw and the shadow that had returned to his eyes. What did he mean about your past? Nothing worth repeating, Kieran replied, helping her mount Penny. Drunk men talk nonsense. They rode out of town in silence, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by a palpable tension. Harriet's mind raced with questions she dared not ask. What secrets was Kieran hiding? What had he done back east that could provoke such animosity? Yet as she watched him riding beside her, his profile strong against the backdrop of mountains and sky, she realized that whatever his past might contain, she trusted the man. He was now the man who had rescued her from the auction block, who treated her with unfailing respect, who brought her wildflowers and ordered books because she mentioned missing them. "Kieran," she said softly, breaking the long silence. "Thank you for today. Despite that unpleasantness at the end, I enjoyed our outing very much." He turned to her, surprise evident in his expression, followed by a softening of the hard lines around his mouth. "I'm glad," he said simply. By the time they reached the ranch, the tension had dissipated, replaced by the comfortable ease that had grown between them over the past month. As Kieran helped her down from Penny, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Harriet felt a warm flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of riding. That evening, after supper, they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance above the creek. Harriet had brought out a quilt to ward off the slight chill in the air, and they sat close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. "Harriet," Kieran said after a long, comfortable silence, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "Yes?" she prompted when he didn't continue. "There's a social at the church in Pine Creek next Saturday, a larger town about 20 miles south. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. Would you like to attend?" Harriet turned to him in surprise. "A social?" Kieran looked slightly embarrassed. "Mrs. Lee mentioned it today. I don't usually go to such things, but I thought you might enjoy getting out and meeting some of the other families in the area." "I'd like that very much," Harriet replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Good," Kieran said, a rare smile lighting his features. "It's settled then." The week leading up to the social passed in a flurry of activity. Harriet spent hours carefully altering one of the dresses from the trunk, a pretty blue silk that had been too formal for daily wear at the ranch. She took in the waist, adjusted the neckline to be more fashionable, and added some lace trim she found in Mrs. Wilson's mercantile during a quick trip Kieran made to town. Kieran, too, seemed to be preparing for the event with unusual attention to detail. He had Jake Miller pick up a new shirt when the young man went to Pine Creek for supplies, and on the morning of the social, Harriet spotted him attempting to trim his own hair with dubious results. "Let me help you with that," she offered, taking the scissors from his hands before he could protest. "Sit down." Kieran complied with surprising docility, sitting on a kitchen chair while Harriet draped a towel around his shoulders. She worked carefully, evening out the uneven patches he had created and trimming the dark hair neatly around his ears and neck. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Much better." "Thank you," Kieran said, running a hand through his newly trimmed hair. His fingers brushed against hers as she removed the towel, and both of them stilled for a moment at the contact. Harriet cleared her throat and moved away. "I should get ready. What time will we leave?" "In about an hour," Kieran replied. "I'll hitch up the wagon." Rather than riding horseback, they would be taking the wagon to Pine Creek, allowing Harriet to arrive with her dress unwrinkled. It was a practical decision, but Harriet couldn't help feeling that it made the outing seem more like a proper social engagement between a man and a woman, rather than an employer and his housekeeper. In her room, Harriet took special care with her appearance. She washed her hair and pinned it up in a style her mother had taught her, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. The blue silk dress fit perfectly after her alterations, emphasizing her slender waist and complementing her eyes. When she emerged from her room, Kieran was waiting in the main room, dressed in his new shirt, clean jeans, and a vest she had never seen before. He had even polished his boots. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You look beautiful," he said finally, his voice slightly hoarse. Harriet felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The journey to Pine Creek passed pleasantly, with Kieran pointing out landmarks and telling her about the families they would meet at the social. Harriet listened with interest, but part of her attention was constantly drawn to the man beside her, the way the sunlight caught the silver at his temples, the strength in his hands as he handled the reins, the deep timbre of his voice. Pine Creek proved to be considerably larger than the small settlement near Hayes Ranch, with proper streets, several stores, a hotel, and a white-painted church whose doors stood open to welcome guests to the social. Wagons and horses filled the area around the church, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted out to greet them. Kieran helped Harriet down from the wagon, offering his arm with a formal courtesy that made her smile. As they approached the church, several people called out greetings to Kieran, expressing surprise and pleasure at his attendance. "Hayes, didn't expect to see you here. Kieran, about time you joined us for a social." Kieran acknowledged the greetings with nods and brief responses, but Harriet could sense his discomfort at being the center of attention. It only increased when people noticed her on his arm, curious gazes and whispered comments following them as they entered the church hall. The interior had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor cleared for dancing. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while musicians set up in a corner, tuning their instruments. "Mr. Hayes, what a pleasant surprise." A tall woman with iron gray hair approached them, her smile genuine. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "Mrs. Thornton." Kieran greeted her respectfully. "This is Miss Harriet Montgomery." "Harriet, Mrs. Thornton is the wife of Pine Creek's doctor and the organizer of these socials." "How do you do?" Harriet said, offering her hand. Mrs. Thornton clasped it warmly. "Very well, my dear. It's a pleasure to meet you. We've all been curious about the young woman who managed to draw our reclusive Mr. Hayes out of his shell." Harriet felt Kieran stiffen beside her, but maintained her polite smile. "Mr. Hayes has been kind enough to bring me tonight, so I might meet more people in the area." "Well, we're delighted to have you both, Mrs. Thornton said, patting Harriet's hand. "Now, you must try the refreshments. Mrs. Peterson's apple cider is not to be missed." As the evening progressed, Harriet found herself introduced to what seemed like the entire population of Pine Creek and the surrounding ranches. Most were welcoming, though she detected curiosity and speculation in many of their glances. The music started, and couples took to the floor for a lively reel. Harriet watched with enjoyment, tapping her foot in time to the music. "Would you like to dance?" Kieran asked unexpectedly, holding out his hand. Harriet looked up at him in surprise. "I didn't know you danced." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "There's a great deal you don't know about me, Miss Montgomery." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. As it turned out, Kieran was an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence and grace that belied his usual reserved demeanor. "Where did you learn a dance like this?" Harriet asked as they circled each other, the steps of the dance bringing them briefly together before pulling them apart again. "Boston," he replied, then seemed to regret the admission. "A long time ago." They danced several more dances, gradually relaxing into the joy of the music and movement. Harriet couldn't remember the last time she had felt so carefree, laughing as Kieran swung her through a particularly energetic turn. During a break in the dancing, while Kieran fetched them cups of cider, a young woman about Harriet's age approached her. "You must be Miss Montgomery," she said with a friendly smile. "I'm Rebecca Peterson. My family's ranch borders Mr. Hayes's land to the south." "It's lovely to meet you," Harriet replied, grateful for the overture of friendship. "I must say, we're all quite amazed," Rebecca continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Kieran Hayes hasn't attended a social in the 5 years he's lived here, and he's certainly never danced with anyone before tonight." "Really?" Harriet glanced toward where Kieran stood by the refreshment table, engaged in conversation with an older man. "Oh yes," Rebecca nodded. "He's always been polite but distant. Most of the unmarried ladies gave up on him long ago." She studied Harriet with frank curiosity. "You must be something special to have brought him out of his shell." Before Harriet could respond, Kieran returned with their cider. Rebecca greeted him with a warm smile. "You're Miss Montgomery, and I were just getting acquainted, Mr. Hayes." "Miss Peterson." Kieran nodded politely. "I trust your father's cattle are doing well this season?" "Very well, thank you," Rebecca replied. "And speaking of my father, I believe he wanted to discuss something with you. He's over by the door." As Kieran excused himself to speak with Mr. Peterson, Rebecca turned back to Harriet. "You must come to tea at our ranch sometime. It would be nice to have another young woman to talk with. It gets lonesome out here sometimes." "I'd like that very much," Harriet said sincerely, touched by the invitation. The evening continued pleasantly, with more dancing, conversation, and delicious food. As the hour grew late, Harriet noticed Kieran becoming increasingly tense, his eyes darting to the door whenever someone new entered. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly when they had a moment alone. "No," he replied, though the tightness around his eyes belied his words. "It's just getting late. We should start back soon." Before they could leave, however, Mrs. Thornton approached with a distinguished-looking gentleman in tow. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Montgomery, I don't believe you've met our new marshal, James Foster. He arrived from Denver last week." The marshal was a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that took in everything around him. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "I've heard a great deal about you." Kieran shook the offered hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Marshal, welcome to Pine Creek." "And Miss Montgomery," the marshal continued, turning to Harriet. "It's a pleasure." "Likewise, Marshal Foster," Harriet replied, noting the way the man's gaze lingered on her face, as if committing her features to memory. "I understand you're working as Mr. Hayes's housekeeper," Foster said conversationally. "Have you been in Colorado long?" "All my life," Harriet answered, suddenly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "I was born in Colorado Springs." "Interesting," the marshal murmured. "I was in Colorado Springs recently. Perhaps we have acquaintances in common." Harriet felt Kieran tense beside her. "I'm afraid we should be going, Marshal," he said firmly. "It's a long ride back to the ranch." "Of course," Foster nodded, his eyes still fixed on Harriet. "Perhaps we'll have a chance to continue our conversation another time, Miss Montgomery." As they left the church, Harriet could feel the marshal's gaze following them. Kieran helped her into the wagon with a gentleness that contrasted with the obvious tension in his body. They rode in silence for several miles, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, but Harriet barely noticed their beauty, too preoccupied with Kieran's sudden shift in mood. "Did I do something wrong?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Kieran glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Wrong? No, of course not. You've hardly spoken since we left the social." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "I apologize. It's not you, Harriet. It's complicated." "Does it have something to do with Marshal Foster?" Kieran's hands tightened on the reins. "Why do you ask that?" "You changed when he approached us," Harriet said softly. "And he seemed particularly interested in me." For a long moment, Kieran said nothing. Then, "Foster isn't just a marshal. He's also a Pinkerton detective." "A detective?" Harriet's confusion deepened. "But why would that concern us?" Kieran slowed the wagon, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight, his expression was grave. "Harriet, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before." "About your contract." A cold knot of fear formed in Harriet's stomach. What about it? There is no contract, Kieran said quietly. I never filed the papers. Legally, you've been free since the day I brought you to the ranch. Harriet stared at him, struggling to comprehend his words. I don't understand. You paid $1,000. To get you away from that auction block, yes, Kieran confirmed. But I never intended to hold you to any contract. I couldn't. After what I saw happening to you, I couldn't bear the thought of owning another person, even on paper. Then why didn't you tell me? Harriet asked, a mixture of confusion and hurt washing over her. Kieran looked away, his profile stark against the night sky. At first, I thought you needed time to recover, to feel safe. Then, as days passed, it became harder to find the right moment. He paused. And selfishly, I feared you would leave once you knew. Leave? Harriet echoed. Where would I go? Anywhere you wished, Kieran replied simply. You're an educated woman, Harriet. You could find work as a teacher as you once dreamed. You could start a new life in Denver or any other city. And is that what you want? Harriet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For me to leave? Kieran's eyes met hers, and the raw emotion in them took her breath away. No, he said hoarsely. God help me, it's the last thing I want. The confession hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Harriet's heart raced as she processed his words, the implications of what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. What does this have to do with Marshall Foster? Kieran sighed heavily. Foster isn't here by chance. He's investigating a series of thefts in Colorado Springs, specifically embezzlement from the bank where your father kept his accounts. Harriet felt as if the ground had dropped from beneath her. My father? But that's impossible. He was a victim of his own gambling debts. That's what his creditors claimed, Kieran said carefully. But according to Foster, there's evidence suggesting your father was framed that someone else stole the money and made it appear as if he had gambling debts he couldn't pay. But then why would they? Harriet trailed off as the horrible truth dawned on her. Oh God. They sold me to cover debts that never existed. Kieran nodded grimly. I believe so. And I think Foster suspects it too. That's why he was so interested in you tonight. I need to speak with him, Harriet said, straightening her spine. If what you're saying is true, then whoever did this must be brought to justice. I agree, Kieran said, surprising her. But you need to understand something first. Once Foster investigates your situation, he'll discover that you've been living at my ranch, ostensibly as an indentured servant, but without any legal contract. That could cause complications. What kind of complications? Kieran's expression turned pained. The kind that involve a single man and a single woman living alone together for months. Your reputation could be irreparably damaged, Harriet. Harriet hadn't considered that aspect. In the safe cocoon of Hayes Ranch, she had almost forgotten how the outside world might view their arrangement. I see, she said quietly. There's more, Kieran continued, his voice growing even more serious. The things Burroughs said in town about my past. They weren't entirely untrue. Harriet waited, her heart pounding, as Kieran visibly struggled with what to say next. Before I came west, I lived in Boston. My family was wealthy, old money, banking and shipping. I was engaged to be married to the daughter of my father's business partner. His voice took on a hollow quality. I discovered that my father and his partner were involved in fraud on a massive scale, ruining countless small investors while enriching themselves. What did you do? Harriet asked softly. I confronted them. When they refused to make amends, I threatened to expose them. Kieran's hands tightened on the reins. The night before I planned to go to the authorities, there was a fire at my fiancé's home. She and her mother died. My father claimed it was an accident, but I knew he was responsible. Horror filled Harriet at the magnitude of what he was describing. Your own father? Kieran nodded grimly. I had no proof, nothing that would stand up in court. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I publicly renounced my family, took what money was rightfully mine, and came west to start a new life. My father disowned me, of course. Last I heard, he was telling everyone I had gone mad with grief over my fiancé's death. That's why you understood, Harriet whispered. When you saw me on that auction block, you understood what it was like to have your life destroyed by someone else's greed. Yes, Kieran admitted, though my suffering was nothing compared to yours. They had reached the turnoff to Hayes Ranch, but instead of continuing home, Kieran stopped the wagon on a rise overlooking the moonlit valley. In the distance, the lights of the ranch house twinkled like earthbound stars. Harriet, he said, turning to face her fully, I'm telling you all this because you deserve the truth, and because tomorrow I intend to ride to Pine Creek and speak with Marshall Foster. I'll tell him everything I know about your situation, and I'll face whatever consequences come my way for the unorthodox way I've handled things. No, Harriet said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I won't let you sacrifice yourself. We'll go together, and I'll tell Marshall Foster that I stayed at your ranch willingly as your housekeeper and that you have always treated me with the utmost respect. It may not be that simple, Kieran warned. Once people start talking. Let them talk, Harriet interrupted. I know the truth, and so do you. Kieran studied her face in the moonlight, wonder and something deeper, more profound, in his eyes. Harriet Montgomery, you are the bravest woman I have ever known. Without thinking, Harriet reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the seat between them. Not brave, she said softly. Just tired of letting others determine my fate. Kieran turned his hand beneath hers, entwining their fingers. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through Harriet's entire body. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, his voice lower now, intimate in the quiet night. Something I've wanted to say for weeks, but hadn't the right. Harriet's heart quickened. Yes, I love you, Kieran said simply. I think I began falling in love with you that first day, when you looked at me from that auction block with such dignity despite your circumstances. And every day since has only deepened those feelings. The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Harriet felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. I love you too, she whispered. I've tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, or that it would be inappropriate given our situation, but the truth is, I fell in love with the man who helped me down and said, "You're coming home." Kieran lifted his free hand to her face, gently brushing away a tear with his thumb. May I kiss you, Harriet? In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with exquisite tenderness, a kiss that spoke of reverence and restraint and a depth of feeling that took her breath away. Harriet had been kissed before awkward, fumbling encounters with boys from Colorado Springs, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way Kieran's kiss seemed to touch not just her lips but her very soul. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens tomorrow with Foster, whatever people may say or think, know this: I will stand by you, protect you, love you, for as long as you'll allow me to. I want forever, Harriet said softly, surprised by her own boldness. Kieran smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. Then forever it shall be. They drove the rest of the way to the ranch in a different kind of silence, one filled not with tension but with possibility, with the unspoken promise of a future together. As they approached the house, Harriet saw it with new eyes, not as her workplace or temporary shelter, but as home. Their home. The following morning, they rode to Pine Creek together, side by side on their horses. Harriet wore a simple but dignified dress, her head held high despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Kieran had offered to speak with Foster alone, but she had insisted on accompanying him. This was her fight too. They found the marshal at his office, a small building next to the jailhouse. He seemed unsurprised to see them, gesturing for them to take seats across from his desk. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Montgomery," he greeted them, his keen eyes moving between them. "I had a feeling I might be seeing you soon." "Marshal Foster," Kieran began formally. "We've come to provide information regarding the Colorado Springs bank embezzlement case you're investigating, particularly as it pertains to Edward Montgomery and his daughter." Foster's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And what information might that be?" For the next hour, they laid out everything they knew: Harriet's father's sudden death, the appearance of creditors claiming gambling debts, her sale at auction, and Kieran's intervention. Harriet spoke clearly and directly about her time at Hayes Ranch, emphasizing that she had stayed willingly and been treated with respect. The marshal listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, regarding them thoughtfully. "That's quite a story," he said finally, "and it confirms some of my suspicions about this case. What happens now?" Harriet asked, her hand finding Kieran's almost unconsciously. Foster's gaze dropped to their clasped hands, then back to their faces. "Now, Miss Montgomery, I continue my investigation. The men who claim to be your father's creditors are my primary suspects. If what you've told me is true, and I believe it is, they committed fraud, kidnapping, and human trafficking." "Will Harriet need to testify?" Kieran asked, his concern evident. "Eventually, yes," Foster confirmed. "But not immediately. I need to gather more evidence first." He paused, studying them. "In the meantime, I suggest you both consider how to address your living arrangement. Small towns thrive on gossip, and Pine Creek is no exception." Harriet felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Kieran spoke. "I intend to ask Miss Montgomery to marry me, Marshal," he said steadily. "If she'll have me." Harriet turned to him in surprise, not at the sentiment. They had declared their love the night before, but at the public declaration. Foster's expression remained neutral. "I see. Well, that would certainly simplify matters." He stood, signaling the end of the interview. "I'll be in touch when I have more information. Until then, Miss Montgomery, I advise you to stay at Hayes Ranch. You're safer there, especially if these men realize you're a potential witness against them." They left the marshal's office with mixed emotions: relief that Foster believed them, anxiety about the investigation ahead, and, for Harriet at least, a fluttering anticipation about Kieran's words. They stopped for lunch at the hotel dining room, finding a quiet corner table where they could speak privately. As soon as they were seated, Harriet addressed the statement that had been echoing in her mind since they left Foster's office. "Did you mean what you said to the marshal? About asking me to marry you?" Kieran met her gaze steadily. "I did, though I had planned a more romantic proposal than blurting it out in a lawman's office." Despite the gravity of their situation, Harriet felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps you could try again now. Just the two of us." Something like wonder crossed Kieran's face, followed by a slow smile that transformed his features. He reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. "Harriet Montgomery," he said softly, "from the moment I saw you standing on that auction block, something in me recognized something in you, a kindred spirit, a soul that called to mine. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought warmth and light back into my home and my heart." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Kieran Hayes, I will marry you." His smile deepened, eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made her heart skip. "When we return to the ranch," he said, "I have something for you, my mother's ring. I've kept it all these years, waiting for you, though I didn't know it." They finished their meal quickly, both eager to return home. As they rode back to Hayes Ranch, Harriet felt as if she were floating, The events of the past months, the auction block, the tears, the fear receding like a tide, leaving behind the shore of a new beginning. At the ranch, Kieran helped her dismount, then asked her to wait on the porch while he retrieved something from his room. Harriet sat in one of the rocking chairs, gazing out at the land that would now truly be her home. Kieran returned moments later, a small velvet box in his hand. He knelt before her chair, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my grandmother's, then my mother's," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Now I hope it will be yours, for the rest of our days together." "It's beautiful," Harriet breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Kieran rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was deeper than the one they had shared the previous night, filled with promise and a carefully restrained passion that made Harriet's knees weak. "How soon can we be married?" she asked when they finally parted. "As soon as you wish," Kieran replied. "The circuit preacher will be in Pine Creek this Sunday. We could speak with him then, arrange for a ceremony the following week." "Yes," Harriet nodded eagerly. "I don't want to wait." They were married 2 weeks later in the Pine Creek Church, with the Miller brothers, the Lees, Rebecca Peterson and her family, and even Mrs. Wilson from the Mercantile in attendance. Harriet wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make, with lace trim from Mrs. Wilson's store. In her hair, she wore a crown of wildflowers that Kieran had gathered for her that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Kieran leaned down to kiss her, Harriet felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. The journey from that auction block to this moment had been unexpected and often difficult, but standing beside the man she loved, surrounded by people who had come to care for them both, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The reception was held at the Peterson Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns strung from the branches. There was dancing and laughter, good food, and better company. Even Marshall Foster made an appearance, taking Kieran aside for a brief conversation that ended with handshakes and what appeared to be congratulations. "What did the Marshal want?" Harriet asked when her new husband returned to her side. "To tell me they've arrested 2 men in Colorado Springs in connection with your father's case," Kieran replied, his arms sliding around her waist. "Former bank employees who embezzled funds and framed your father. Foster believes they'll face serious charges, including kidnapping and human trafficking for what they did to you." Relief washed over Harriet. "So it's over?" "It's over," Kieran confirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Your father's name will be cleared, and the men responsible will face justice." As the celebration continued around them, Kieran led Harriet away from the crowd, toward a quiet spot beneath a massive cottonwood tree. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with patterns of light and shadow. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "More than I ever imagined possible," Harriet replied honestly, tilting her face up to his. "When I stood on that auction block 2 months ago, I thought my life was ending. I never dreamed it was just beginning." Kieran's eyes darkened with emotion. "When I saw you there, in tears, something broke in me, and something else healed. You saved me as much as I saved you, Harriet Hayes." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "I love you, Kieran Hayes." "And I love you," he murmured, lowering his lips to hers. "From now until forever." As they returned to their wedding celebration hand in hand, Harriet couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought her here. From the darkest moment of her life standing in tears on that auction block to the brightest becoming the wife of the man who had helped her down and said those life-changing words, "You're coming home." And home, she now knew with absolute certainty, wasn't a place at all. It was wherever they were together. 5 years later, Harriet stood on the porch of Hayes Ranch, watching as Kieran taught their 4-year-old son, Samuel, to ride his pony. Beside her, their 2-year-old daughter, Rose, clapped her hands with delight as her big brother trotted in a small circle, Kieran walking alongside with a steadying hand on the pony's bridle. "Mama, look," Samuel called, his face alight with pride. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, darling," Harriet called back, her heart swelling with love for her family. "You're doing wonderfully." Rose tugged at her skirt. "Me ride too, Mama." "When you're a bit older, sweetheart," Harriet promised, lifting the little girl into her arms. Rose had her father's blue eyes and her mother's chestnut hair, a perfect blend of them both. The ranch had prospered over the years. With the help of the Miller brothers, who had stayed on as foremen, Kieran had expanded his herd and his land holdings. The house, too, had grown additional rooms for the children, a proper study for Kieran, and a small schoolroom where Harriet taught not only their children but also those of neighboring ranchers 2 days a week. Her dream of becoming a teacher had been fulfilled, though in a way she never could have anticipated. And her marriage to Kieran had deepened with each passing year, their love growing stronger through the joys and challenges they faced together. Marshall Foster had kept his word. The men responsible for framing Harriet's father and selling her at auction had been convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Her father's name had been cleared, and a small inheritance, the true remains of his estate once the embezzled funds were accounted for, had been restored to Harriet. She and Kieran had used it to establish a scholarship fund for young women in Colorado Springs who wished to pursue education. As Kieran finished the riding lesson and lifted Samuel from the pony, Harriet's thoughts drifted, as they sometimes did, to that day on the auction block. The terror and despair she had felt then seemed almost unreal now, like a distant nightmare that faded in the bright light of her present happiness. Kieran approached the porch, Samuel riding proudly on his shoulders. "I think we have a natural horseman here," he announced, swinging the boy down to stand beside him. "Just like his father," Harriet agreed, setting Rose down to greet her brother and father. Kieran stepped onto the porch, leaning down to kiss Harriet softly. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," he murmured against her lips. Even after 5 years, his kisses still made her heart race. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she replied with a smile. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Harriet and Kieran sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, their bodies fitting together with the comfortable familiarity of long-married lovers. "I had a letter from Rebecca today," Harriet said, referring to Rebecca Peterson, who had married a banker from Denver 3 years earlier. "She's expecting their second child in the fall." "That's wonderful news," Kieran replied, his fingers playing idly with a strand of Harriet's hair. "Will they visit before then?" "She hopes to come in August, before travel becomes too difficult." Harriet nestled closer into his embrace. She asked if we might consider having a third child to keep pace with her. Kieran's chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. "And what did you tell her?" Harriet tilted her face up to his, a mischievous smile playing at her lips. "I told her we might already be ahead of her." It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Kieran's eyes widened, then softened with wonder. "Harriet, are you saying?" She nodded, placing his hand gently over her still, flat stomach. "Dr. Thornton confirmed it yesterday. We're having another baby, probably in early February." Kieran's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her into a tender kiss. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "For our children, for our life together, for everything." "It is I who should thank you," Harriet replied softly. "You saved me that day in Willow Creek. You gave me a home when I had nothing." "You gave me far more," Kieran countered, drawing back to look into her eyes. "Before you, I had a house, land, cattle, but it wasn't a home. You brought love back into my life when I thought that part of me was dead forever." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, contemplating the blessing of another child joining their family. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle creaking of the porch swing, and the soft rustling of the cottonwood leaves in the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about it?" Kieran asked eventually. "That day on the auction block?" Harriet considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with fear anymore, but with a kind of wonder at how the worst moment of my life led me to the best." Kieran tightened his arm around her. "I still see you sometimes, as you were then so brave despite your tears, standing with such dignity, while men bid on you like livestock." His voice grew husky with emotion. "I think I fell in love with you in that moment, though I didn't recognize it yet." "And I with you," Harriet said softly, "when you helped me down and said those words that changed everything. You're coming home." Kieran pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Little did I know then that you were bringing me home too, to a life filled with love and family and purpose." As the stars continued their stately dance across the heavens, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought them here from tears on an auction block to this perfect contentment. Whatever challenges the future might hold, she knew they would face them together, their love a fortress against any storm. "I love you, Kieran Hayes," she whispered, lifting her face for his kiss. "And I love you, Harriet Hayes," he replied, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness that still made her heart sing. From that first day, through all our days to come forever,